that's worked out of everything. We've got a cast of thousands, or a cast of several today. It's a cornucopia of people who will all have a short time to put their case. But first of all, that's a special feature of this book are the political cartoons. I don't know if we can we see Dave Miller? Is he there? Dave Miller. Dave Miller is an absolute find. Put your sound on, please, Dave. He's produced a whole series of cartoons. Please.
Hello.
No?
Can you hear me?
Hello. Would you tell us about your cartoons, please, Dave?
Yeah. Can you hear me, John? Yeah.
Yes, we can. But go for it. Tell us how you started to do these cartoons.
Yeah. Well, this I basically started doing the cartoons when pandemic started at the beginning, and I had a whole lot of pictures. I didn't really know what to do with them, and then I saw John was looking for people to contribute to his to one of his books. So I got in touch, and he liked them, and I changed them, and since then this will be the third book that I've worked on. And
can we see some of your cartoons?
Yeah, can you see them? Yeah.
So month by month, week by week, he charts the progress based on the public record. And there we are. Some faces you recognise there. Dominic Cummings, Boris is in there somewhere. Matt Hancock's in there, and he actually takes stuff from the public records and turns it into a cartoon strip. I mean, the book is worth buying just for these cartoons alone. And how do you decide what to put in, Dave? How do you decide what to put in?
Well, yeah, I just go through each month and just pick out the main themes, and then try to come up with something within each month that sort of tells a bit of story around those themes, really, and maybe a little bit of sort of I don't know, try to look for the continuity and try to find the humor in there, really.
Yeah, some people say these are rather left-wing. Do you accept that charge?
Well, I try to be objective, but yeah, I suppose they are a bit left-leaning. Yeah, because I am myself. But I have tried to be objective and as factual as possible, and everything's sort of double-checked, and so I followed the actual quotes, and pretty much so. So I try not to be too biased.
Right, you're going to do a cartoon for us in the course of this program, I hope, which summarises February.
I'm in the middle of working on something.
Later on,
yeah, hopefully, yeah.
Okay, all right. So the book is worth buying just for that, right? Okay, first of the many guests. If we go to the great Rod Liddell, who has just joined us. Rod from the Spectator. Rod, you're sort of all over the place on the lockdown, aren't you? I mean, you're skeptical on some, not skeptical on other things. Is that correct?
I think you'll find what it's called, John, is dispassionate, and I change according to how the evidence changes, as opposed to some of the people who I dare say we will be hearing from, who probably believe that the virus was cooked up in Boris Johnson's laboratory as a deliberate attempt on the part of the Conservative government to kill everybody. I think it's been pretty much a game of two halves, Gary. I think you can divide it into two between February 2020 and round about early November 2020. I think you could reasonably accuse the government of being dilatory, slow to lock down, desperately slow, paradoxically, to close our borders, given that this was a government, the party which had insisted that Brexit was necessary so we could have control over our borders. But I think they were slow for reasons possibly of incompetence, but possibly also of ideology, in that I think Boris and many of the people who surrounded him at that time were wary of big government intervention in such a thing and disliked the idea of telling the entire country that it had to do things which it did not want to do. I think there were later mistakes. I think the ludicrous July the 4th Independence Day, as it was put, when Britain wakes from its great hibernation, as I think Boris put it at the time, was markedly over-trumped. We shouldn't have done that. It should have been a more gradual easing from lockdown. I didn't agree with Rishi Sunak's eat out to help out policy. I thought it was absurd, not least because it came in the week that the government launched its obesity strategy, which is almost certainly the cause of the parlous death rate which we've had in this country. And I wasn't convinced by the tiers either, largely because I think it confused the public. So I think there was that. And then I think since then, you would have to say that the government has upped its game a little bit. It was certainly, and you can take this back to July, if you like, when Matt Hancock and the government began organising the delivery of vaccines to this country. It is incontestable, I would say, to the other contributors to this to this discussion. It is utterly incontestable that us not being in the European Union has enabled us to recover from this pandemic far, far quicker than those countries which are in the European Union. Whatever other problems you may have with Brexit, that is utterly incontestable. And I think the government has done a fairly good job of getting the vaccine, through the genius of the scientists, obviously, but of getting the vaccine organised, shipped out and tested. I think it's got a harder job selling the vaccine to those people who are not either A, obedient, like the elderly, or B, at risk, like the elderly. So I think that the take-up rate will reduce quite considerably in the next month or so, and that may be a problem for the future. On lockdown, I don't know about lockdown. The evidence seems to be contrary. The World Health Organization seems to think that lockdown doesn't work, that the only thing it does is delay the issue. It may be that at times, particularly in November, December, we needed to delay the issue so that the health service wasn't overburdened. Its efficacy in actually dealing with the virus, though, I would think is pretty minimal. And I would go along with much of what I suspect Toby Young will say about that in particular. The ideology, it is interesting the way that this virus has been kind of co-opted into both the culture and the political wars, in that by and large, and this is very, very broad, and it doesn't, for example, pertain to me particularly, but by and large, if you were for leaving the European Union, if you were one of those voters who voted Conservative, one of the Red Wall voters, if you're to the right on many issues, you are sceptical of lockdown, largely because of its big business, anti-libertarian character, which would seem to be the case. If, on the other hand, you are very left-wing or in favour of staying within the European Union, you may never wish lockdown to end. I think, and so we do have a kind of gap between those two poles. One more thing I would say. I think there are two or three areas where, when the investigations come along, which surely they will, the government is going to be vulnerable. First is in the sluggishness with which it first addressed the issue. Secondly, care homes and the way in which either the National Health Service or the government dealt with the people who lived in those care homes. Thirdly, there's our parlous death rate, which is the second highest in Western Europe. Is the highest in Western Europe and one of the highest in the world. I would say on the death rate, it's way too early to judge the government on that, for a couple of reasons. If you look at the country which is second in the list in Western Europe for an unpleasant death rate, it is Portugal. And by no coincidence, Portugal is the second most obese country in the European Union. My suspicion is that obesity will have proved to have been far more calamitous to the people of Great Britain than the government itself.
If I can ask you one question,
Yeah.
what mark would you give the government up until the vaccination program? What mark would you give them for how they conducted the pandemic? And
bearing in mind that it was a new government which didn't really know what had hit it, and was set to embark on a vast program of change and uplift for the north of England, particularly. Nonetheless, up until November-ish, 4 to 5.
4 to 5 out of 10.
Yeah.
And since then, the vaccination program, has that transformed Boris's?
Well, clearly, according to the opinion polls, it has. I mean, the Conservative Party is back in the lead, and back in the lead by quite a few points. I think it probably deserves a 7 or an 8 since then. I still worry about mixed messages. I still worry about Boris changing his mind within a couple of days, and indeed following whichever Pict or Celt decides to do something different. I think there are problems of governance. Sure, I get that. But I think that by and large, the most important thing at the moment is we get the vaccine out and rolling, and we've done better than anyone else in the world, with the possible exception of the United Arab Emirates.
Have you noticed a new Boris emerging post-Cummings?
Yes, I mean, I think that's an important point, John, to be honest. I think that the dilatory nature of the government changed markedly once Boris had copped the virus. I think that was immediately evident. Since then, I don't see much change. I still think there's been too much flim-flamming, pussyfooting, flip-flopping, call it whatever you will, and too often Boris is prepared to do the precise opposite of what he said he was going to do a week previously. I don't think that gives the government a great deal of credibility with the public. But that being said, we are working our way towards a kind of, if not sunlit upland, then at least an upland, and we will be ahead of the rest of Europe in doing that.
And will the CRG triumph in the end? The coronavirus recovery group, will they triumph in the end? Will triumph in the end?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I think there are huge questions which we can ask not only of the government but also of ourselves in the media. Partly our lack of scientific understanding, and partly our inability to gauge levels of risk. And I think the government also needs to learn that as well. And I think it's something which I'm sure Toby will deal with, that I don't think people do grasp the different rates of risk that there are. When you look at I don't know who B is. Who's that?
Never mind.
Quite interested to hear her.
No, let's move on if we can, Rod, because it's going to be very, very fast-moving program. This one. Let's move on, if we can, to David Banks, the former editor of the Daily Mirror. Banksy, are you there and are you up?
I'm here.
Right, David Banks lives in North
always a very difficult thing to do.
Formerly editor of the Mirror, formerly editor of the New York Daily News, who's written a very, very good chapter about life in his one village during the pandemic. How have people coped, Banksy?
Well, I'm here to speak for the sunlit uplands of Northumberland, which is about as far north in England as you can go. And listening to Rod, I'm here to represent the obese and as a near neighbour of the Celts and Picts. I think communities in rural areas have done a good sight better out of the pandemic than you in the metropolis have. I think it's bound together, our community. I speak in a parish that is a parish of six villages, very small, almost hamlets by and large. A couple of village shops, a couple of pubs, 1 or 2 part-time post offices, that sort of community to which I now belong. And by and large, and it's a great farming community, of course, by and large, we've done reasonably well. We've watched the rest of the country south of us get itself into all sorts of twists and knots because of the perceived inactivity of the government or its reluctance to operate and to make decisions. And while we have actually got on with life quite well, local shops have prospered, and the community has prospered in a way that I would say it's been brought together. Sounds like a cliche, but it has been brought together very quickly. All of those villages I mentioned formed COVID support groups to look after people like me, the elderly and the vulnerable. Shopping was delivered, chemist runs were made for older people. It's been incredibly heartening. It's a different story, I think, from the story you are hearing and will hear from people in cities and urban areas. I feel that, what is it, we chatted and you called it a form of Darwinism, rural Darwinism, and that's what we've been sort of forced back to, but we quite welcome it. It's been difficult because the pubs have closed and the village halls can't operate because we're under this lockdown. But by and large, lockdown hasn't killed anyone. It's protected us, and I think we've appreciated that.
What's it taught you about humanity? Lockdown in your village?
Oh, in my parish, in my village, it's taught me a great deal about humanity. I knew there were good people here. I didn't know quite how good they are. They've been brilliant. I'm getting on myself now, and I'm a bit vulnerable because I've got a number of disorders like obesity that Rod mentioned, and type 2 diabetes, and a whiff of leukemia, that sort of thing. So I kind of need caring for. My wife does it brilliantly, but our neighborhood has been fantastic, and the community locally has been very much strengthened by the experience. We want it to be over, of course, but I think we've got strong through it.
Now, would you like to put a quick plug in for your newspaper, your online newspaper, The Clarion, which is a superb read?
That's very kind of you. As you mentioned very kindly that I'd edited The Mirror, and I worked on both tabloids in New York, and I edited a paper or two in Australia. But I came back to The Mirror, and I was kind of retired from it by illness in a way, and great age, of course. But I now write as a columnist, and I edit voiceofthenorth.net, which and it incorporates my old village or parish newspaper, The Clarion, and it's very successful. Now we've put it online. It's tremendously successful, and I put myself back in the role of cub reporter, I suppose. Voiceofthenorth.net is mainly it's a comment newspaper. It's a views paper, I suppose, online, and we go not just locally, but nationally and very much internationally. We got readers in New York and Australia. They happen to be, I guess, people that I've picked up along the way during my career. But it's again, it's this community thing, and it comes out of Crookham in Northumberland, tiny hamlet, and it goes worldwide. And today, the last couple of days, we've had an average of about 500 hits per day, which for a little thing coming out of my bedroom is pretty impressive.
Okay, thank you very much, Banksy. If you want to buy the book, Banksy's got a wonderful chapter in there on his village. If we can move on, please, to Juliet Ricks, who again wrote another lovely chapter about she wishes the government would stop acting like 5-year-olds and learn their lessons. Juliet, can you expand on that for us, please? Over to you, Juliet.
Yes. So a year on from the start of this pandemic, what have we learned? Well, medics and scientists have been constantly learning and putting their discoveries into practice at an unprecedented rate. Government? Not so much. In fact, I'd say if 5-year-olds learned at this pace, we'd all...
Oh, she seems to have disappeared. Juliet seems to have disappeared, but we'll come back to her in a
Sorry,
minute.
I disappeared.
Keep on talking, Juliet.
Apologies. I was saying that I felt that the government had not learnt quite so much. In fact, if 5-year-olds were learning at that pace, I think we'd all still be in infant school. In fact, it sometimes felt as though that's where we are, with their world-beating nationalistic na-na-na-na-nas swinging round the political playground. More informed minds than mine have said something similar. The appropriately named Larry Brilliant, star epidemiologist who helped eradicate smallpox and has been predicting a pandemic for decades, said that the one thing that's really surprised him about this pandemic has been, I quote, the absolute incompetence of Western governments, particularly in the US and the UK. Boris Johnson started the pandemic year behind the curve, and despite a credible study finding that delaying the first lockdown had cost upwards of 36,000 lives, he didn't seem to learn. Lockdown 2 and 3 both came too late, culminating in the January horror show, The NHS at Breaking Point, and COVID deaths averaging 1,000 people a day. The vaccine rollout has been impressive and much crowed about. The NHS and volunteers have done an incredible job of getting vaccines into arms. And this is the single area in which the government does seem to have acted with some foresight. It's just a shame that their total lack of it in every other department has left us in such desperate need. Countries that have handled the pandemic well, like New Zealand, Australia, and Taiwan, haven't had to hurry. They can afford to wait and watch while we provide them with a population scale trial. Infection rates here are finally falling, but not fast enough. Even now, lockdown is lax and aerosol transmission is little understood by the public. People still queue inside for takeaways. Mask wearing rules are frequently flouted and rarely enforced. And stringent travel restrictions are only just being put chaotically in place more than a year after the virus first hitched a ride into this country, a journey it has since repeated many, many times. The government squandered some of the gains from months of lockdown and 800 million quid on Eat Out to help out. And in a move that even infants knew was ridiculous, sent 3 million primary school children back to their classrooms for one day at the beginning of this term. Take a large pot, add virus, stir thoroughly, and spread. The economy and health have been presented by ministers and others, including the counterfactually named COVID Recovery Group, as pulling in opposite directions. But 5-year-olds know you can't go to school sick or when you're caring for the sick. And a brief glimpse at the figures for countries that locked down quickly and thoroughly shows that they've not only protected their people's health, but also, relatively speaking, their pockets. Health and the economy go hand in hand. This government couldn't even get its messaging right. Half the time ministers didn't know their own rules, and Boris couldn't contain his desire to deliver good news, even if it wasn't quite true or might be potentially lethal. We all hope vaccines are the way out of this mess, but Boris's vaccine cavalry has almost certainly prematurely liberated far too many people he led to believe that they could simply jab and go. Only now are we hearing crucial caveats. No vaccination is 100% effective, even after 2 doses. And we don't yet know how much it prevents transmission. It takes at least 14 days for any significant protection, and we have very little data on how long it lasts. And then there are the variants. Even if far fewer people are getting seriously ill, the more infection there is in circulation, the more mutations occur. That is an immutable part of viral biology. And the more half-immune people, the more likely it is that there will emerge variants that get round the vaccines. And that isn't speculation. That's an issue in the here and now, with the South African variant, a further mutation to the Kent variant, and others of concern. The growing threat to Boris's cavalry has perhaps been a sobering moment for the government. They just might be beginning to learn. Since I wrote the piece for the book, there have been a few green shoots of seriousness, a crocus or two of caution. Ministers might even be ready to move up into the juniors next term, but there's a way to go. As he announced his lockdown lifting roadmap 2 days ago, Boris nodded in the direction of scientific advice, but once again failed to actually follow it. He said the process would be driven by data, not dates, before presenting a timetable structured not around data, but dates. The first of these is March the 8th, when all children go back to school because everyone agrees that kids need to learn. We must hope that the government follows their lead and finally starts to learn the lessons of the last year, so we don't have to suffer another tragic year of mistakes.
Thank you. Now, Rod gave the government a score of 4 or 5 out of 10 for the last year. What score would you give them? That's up until vaccination.
Vaccines aside?
Yes.
2.
2 out of 10. Okay. Thank you very much. Now, to Vicky Price. Vicky Price used to be the Chief Government Economic Advisor, Professor Vicky Price. She'll be talking about the magic money tree, or is it the magic money forest? Hopefully she's there, that Rishi Sunak has generated. I think the borrowing figure is 280 billion, but Vicky will enlighten us that. Vicky, what's it all cost?
It's cost a lot of money, and it's also cost us a lot in terms of growth in the economy. There's no doubt about that. And I do agree with what we heard from Juliet just now in relation to going into lockdown a bit late. The fact that we did go into lockdown a bit late has also meant that we suffered a much sharper fall than many other countries, which has started it earlier. There one mentioned China, of course, which actually managed to achieve positive growth in 2020, amazingly. But of course, lots of other countries, including a number of the European countries that Rod Liddle thought perhaps were doing worse than us, but actually they've fallen a lot less in terms of GDP than we have, with the exception of Spain. So if you look across Europe, we have had the sharpest decline in GDP of 9.9% if you look at the bigger countries. And if you look at what may happen in the future, even though we are now seeing some signs that the end of the downturn is near, we're still going to grow more slowly than other countries in the future, Brexit or no Brexit. And we're not going to catch up, according to most estimates, with where we were pre-pandemic before sometime in the middle of 2022, which is a long time to wait. So first of all, there's been a cost in terms of growth. Second, there's been a huge cost in terms of government borrowing, which I think you hinted at, John. That has gone up very significantly. Now, I'm one of the people who believe, and I think most economists would say, that health and the economy are very closely interlinked. So you can't have one and not have the other. Not having had lockdowns would have been a serious problem, because the issues that we have been encountering with the spread of infections every time we unlocked would have certainly have affected confidence, business confidence, very negatively. And of course, people would not have wanted to go out to work to the extent that we would have liked them to, perhaps, if we wanted the economy to carry on going. But we did, of course, stop both supply and demand. It was a very unusual type of recession that we had during 2020, with this 20% fall that happened in the second quarter, where we stopped people going out to work, and we stopped people, to a considerable extent, also spending. Many sectors, of course, in the later lockdowns did operate properly. So manufacturing that was closed at the beginning of the lockdown periods was then allowed to resume later and did not close when the new lockdowns came. Similarly with construction, which has seen, along with manufacturing, a positive growth, except for the last month, every month since the summer. That has, of course, allowed the recovery to take place. It's also allowed, despite the fact that we slowed down very significantly in the fourth quarter, the quarter not to see another fall in GDP. So unlike Europe overall, countries differ there, we're not in technical recession, because there is no doubt that this quarter, because of the new lockdowns, will see a fall in GDP. But even that fall is not likely to be anything like as severe as we saw before, because we have kept so much of the economy still going, which of course includes not only the public sector, health and so on. It includes lots of IT companies. We kept the banks open. We have kept, as I said, manufacturing and construction. House building has boomed, helped of course by the stamp duty decrease that we saw for houses under 500,000. And people have had quite a lot of money in their pockets because the government has intervened very significantly with the furlough scheme, but also in other ways to ensure that workers were kept on payrolls, and B, of course, that companies didn't suffer as much as they would otherwise have done by all sorts of extensions to repayment methods, but also cheap loans guaranteed by the government. They didn't have to start paying them back or even an interest for a while, and also business rates relief and grants, of course, for smaller firms. So sectors have continued to at least survive, even though we know the screams from the creative sector, sports, and etc., all those venues that we all used to go out to, the retail sector, pubs, hospitality, still in trouble and won't actually open for a while fully. So we're not going to see them bouncing back very quickly, which means that the government has had to borrow and borrow and borrow. First of all, you have the fiscal stabilizers, the automatic fiscal stabilizers. You have a slowdown in growth, as we did in 2020. What you end up doing is you, of course, collect a lot less in terms of revenues, even though in some cases they've kept surprisingly high. But overall, you collect less and you have more to spend in terms of keeping people who are unemployed going. That's the normal course of events. And that's about 100 billion, which has cost the government because of this slowdown. Hopefully some of that will disappear when we get into the next financial year. In addition, the furlough scheme, the business rate relief, the VAT reductions that we've seen in some sectors already, the stamp duty reduction that I mentioned, for example, the extension of universal credits by an extra £20 a week. So all the support that has been given has been very significant, and that is likely to reach something like 400 billion of borrowing for this financial year as a whole. This compares with 55 billion that had been forecast for this year originally, which included a large chunk going into the health service, and 55 billion we borrowed last year. And it is likely, particularly with the extensions of the support we're going to be hearing about in the March budget, much of that has been leaked already, that we're going to need to borrow even more, not more than 400, but we'll continue to have to borrow more than we receive for a number of years. And the earlier forecast where we'll still be borrowing 100 billion in 2024-25. Remember, we were borrowing only 55 last year, and we weren't expected to borrow more than 55 this year originally.
About a minute, Vicky.
Okay, so does it matter? My answer is no. I think we have learned that austerity is a bad thing. We've learned that debts at the high levels that we have now, like 100% of GDP, are perfectly sustainable while interest rates are low. The UK had to move to make up for the slowness of lockdowns. I think what the Chancellor has done so far, despite wasting some of the money on track and trace and PPE that didn't necessarily work, as we know, and contracts that are now being looked at more carefully, had to intervene. And I think we are going to be seeing the government still being prepared to carry on doing so for a while and pushing the economy upwards, hopefully. I think they've done the right thing. At some point, there has to be some reckoning, but we're not going to see that yet. And I think the March the 3rd budget that we're going to see is probably going to support what I'm saying. And I think it has been the right approach.
In 30 seconds, how are we going to pay for it?
Are we going to carry on borrowing? I mean, you did mention the magic money tree. The way that we have managed to borrow so far is, of course, A, because investors were quite prepared to lend to countries like ours, thinking that we were not going to default, but B, because the Bank of England, like other central banks, has come to support that extra financing by buying bonds in the secondary market. So everyone knows full well that if they buy a bond, a government bond, whatever its maturity, there's going to be a willing buyer behind it. And we've had an expansion of quantitative easing by the Bank of England of something like 450 billion, which is more or less what the government needs to borrow this financial year. So yes, a money magic tree, there very much is one.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Now, this session is about different points of view. Toby Young runs, amongst his other activities, a group called Lockdown Skeptics. And Toby's like Marmite. If we could go to Toby, at least one person's pulled out of this session because they wouldn't appear with Toby. But Toby, why are you a lockdown skeptic? Over to you. Over to Toby Young, please. Is he still there? Hello, is Toby Young there?
Can you hear me, David? I mean,
Yes, John, I
John.
can hear you. Fire away, Toby. Right. Go on.
Yeah, sorry.
Why are you a skeptic?
Just to be clear, you said I run a group called Lockdown Skeptics. It's a daily blog. It's lockdownskeptics.org for anyone who's interested. We produce these voluminous daily updates summarizing all the latest COVID news, but through a skeptical lens. We're not COVID deniers. We don't think it's no worse than seasonal flu. We don't think it has any connection with 5G. It's mainly very thoughtful, well-educated, often people with a scientific background commenting skeptically about the latest COVID news. Just a couple of points in response to things that have been said. Julia, I thought, was unduly skeptical about the efficacy of the vaccines. I was a little bit skeptical at first, but having looked at the data following the rollout of the vaccine in Israel in particular, I'm now persuaded that the Pfizer and AstraZeneca vaccines are very, very effective at preventing hospitalizations and deaths from COVID-19. So the data suggests that the AstraZeneca vaccine is 100% effective. In Israel, over 500,000 people have had either 1 or 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine. That's over 500,000, and there hasn't been a single death in that population that's been vaccinated. So while I can understand why she might have been nervous about the efficacy of those vaccines to begin with, I think the data that's emerging from the rollout suggests that they are incredibly effective at preventing fatalities from this disease. I think Vicky said just now that she thought one of the mistakes the UK government had made was to go into a national lockdown too late. And that's certainly a common theme of many criticisms of the government. Sorry about that, Bell. I don't know what's causing it. It's remotely activated. And I think the problem with that criticism of the government is that it assumes that the lockdown imposed last March was effective in preventing COVID deaths, and that had we not locked down, the alarmist predictions of the modelling team in Imperial College and elsewhere would have come true. And I think there's very little reason now, a year later, or almost a year later, to believe that. I mean, the great example that we lockdown skeptics like to cite, the great counterexample, the control, if you will, is Sweden. So Sweden didn't lock down last year. People involved, people engaged in voluntary social distancing. I think schools for people aged 16 and above were closed. Large mass gatherings were banned. But for the most part, the restrictions they had to endure were far, far less draconian than us. And most of their behavior modification was voluntary. And Sweden has a lower number of COVID deaths per million than we do. If you look at the all-cause mortality in Sweden for 2020, it had exactly, and I mean exactly, the same number of deaths per capita as the EU average. But every other country in the EU locked down. Sweden's experience suggests that the lockdown, counterintuitively, didn't do anything, or very little anyway, to prevent the transmission of the virus, hospitalizations and deaths. So the argument that we locked down too late, and had we locked down sooner, we'd have experienced far fewer deaths, I don't think stands up to a forensic examination of the data 11 months later. I'll just give you one other example, which seems to give the lie to the claim that had we locked down earlier, we would have had fewer deaths. Florida in the United States, Governor DeSantis was widely criticized for lifting the lockdown too early and for refusing to lock down again after September 25th. Since September 25th, the stay-at-home order in Florida has been lifted. All businesses are open. Children are back at school. Colleges have reopened, and Florida hasn't experienced a more devastating second wave of the virus than other states that have locked down, like California. And actually, the number of COVID deaths per million in Florida since last September is below the US average. And if in fact you can go further and look at all 11 US states that didn't impose another lockdown last winter, and the average deaths, but I think that the number of deaths per capita from COVID in those 11 US states that didn't lock down is actually lower than in those 39 that did. So the evidence that lockdowns are effective is pretty threadbare. I was just going to go on to say one more thing before you cross-examine me, if that's all right.
Sure.
David said that lockdowns have killed no one, and I would beg to differ. There was a paper published by Civitas last December, written by Tim Knox, former head of the Centre for Policy Studies, and Jim McConnell, and they estimated, I think quite conservatively, that the number of people who are going to die unnecessarily as a result of postponed appointments for cancer treatment and other diseases is 20,000. I think that's conservative. But go beyond that. A professor of risk management, Philip Thomas at Bristol University, he calculates that the economic harm, which Vicky was just talking about, I mean, the projection is that our deficit for 2021 is going to be 420 billion. And our grandchildren are going to be paying that off. The UK economy contracted by almost 10% last year, which is the largest contraction in GDP, I think, since the beginning of the 18th century. And that was caused by the Great Frost. Unemployment is predicted by the Treasury to increase to 2.6 million later this year. That isn't just harm to the economy. As Vicky said, public health and economic health are inextricably linked. And Philip Thomas at Bristol has calculated that the economic impact, and it is an impact of the lockdowns, not the pandemic, because Sweden's economy, where there's been no lockdown, only shrunk by about 2.5% compared to Britain's 10% last year. The economic impact, Philip Thomas has calculated, of the lockdown on the UK will be to foreshorten every UK citizen's life by, on average, 4 months. And if you multiply that by 67 million, that comes to the equivalent of 560,000 unnecessary deaths caused by the lockdown. That's just domestically. If we look at the impact of the global lockdowns on the developing world, that's when it becomes tragic and absolutely catastrophic. And we begin to understand that this is the worst policy error ever committed by Western governments, the decision to emulate what happened in communist China last spring. The impact on the developing world, I mean, it's just extraordinary. The World Bank estimates that 150 million people are going to be plunged into extreme poverty as a result of the global economic recession triggered by the lockdowns by the end of this year. Shunetra Gupta, professor of theoretical epidemiology at Oxford, estimates that 130 million people in the developing world are going to die unnecessarily of starvation, thanks to the impact of the global lockdown. So it's naive to think that lockdowns killed no one. It's going to kill hundreds of millions.
Now, my cross-examination is one quick question. Boris invites you in. He says, Toby, you've got 15 seconds to convince me a libertarian point of view on the lockdown. Your 15 seconds starts now. Talk to Boris.
Boris, the reason I've supported you and campaigned for you all my life, since the moment I met you at Oxford over 35 years ago, is because I've always been confident that you are at heart a liberty-loving Brit. You are in the great tradition of Sid James and George Orwell and Frankie Howard. And that's why I've always loved you. I've always thought you embodied that cavalier spirit in the British character, not the puritanical spirit. You should have stuck to your guns last March. You should have started out, you should have continued as you started out instead of panicking and doing a U-turn. Please recover your instincts. Get back in touch with that conservative I know is in there and lift this sodding lockdown.
Thank you, Toby. Right, moving on if we can. This is a fast-moving little programme. The British press have covered themselves in a bit of glory, or maybe not a bit of glory. Paul Connew was the editor of the Sunday Mirror, is now a media commentator. Paul, give us a short summary of how you think the press has done, and particularly on libertarianism.
I think the press has had a mixed pandemic, but I think they have a very important upcoming role to play, along with politicians, whether they're of the left or the right, and that is to make sure that we get a truly independent, judge-led public inquiry as soon now as possible. I get the feeling that there are those in the cabinet who would like to kick that public inquiry into the long grass for as long as possible, and are also hoping that the undoubted success so far, anyway, of the vaccine procurement rollout program, for which the Prime Minister deservedly takes a share of the credit, will actually somehow immunise the government from the life-costing blunders, through much of 2020. You won't be surprised to know that I rather disagree on the issue that was being made before, on pandemic controls by Toby. When the history of the UK's COVID crisis finally comes to be written and that judge-led inquiry finally takes place, there are certain big questions that should lie at the heart of it. Among them, how much did Boris Johnson's personal tussle between his libertarian instincts and the case for an injection of emergency authoritarianism play into that year of catastrophic mistakes that was 2020? How much did Boris's belief in British, or perhaps more accurately English, exceptionalism help chalk up the world's worst per capita death rate in December and the worst economic damage of any G7 nation? And how much did, what I'm told was an informal mutual populist pact between some of the hard Brexiteers in and around number 10 and their counterparts in the Trump White House play into playing down the early stages of COVID-19 and rather bigging up talk of that mythical US-UK super trade deal. I think the mutual death rates, on both sides of the Atlantic speak volumes. And if there's two words that capture the Johnson government's pandemic record, apart from the vaccine procurement success, those two words, in big bold capitals, are too late. Too late to grasp the severity of the virus, too late, as well as doing too little to close down the UK's borders, which is beyond satire, as Rod was saying, for a man who fought and won the Brexit referendum campaign and a general election largely on the basis of controlling our borders. And while the PM does indeed share in that success story over vaccinations, we should be aware of certain dangers ahead. Among them, what I think is going to be a concerted campaign coming up to spin the vaccine success as sort of an antidote to all those fatal blunders and misjudgments earlier. And beware, too, of a desire to kick that truly independent forensic inquiry still further into the long grass, certainly beyond what the families of those who lost their lives alone on the COVID wards or on the front line of the NHS and the care homes deserve. And beware, too, of potential efforts to dilute the scope and scale of that public inquiry, something all politicians, whether left or right, and the media, whatever their political loyalties, ought to fight against. And because every time you hear now any reference, and they're very rare to that public inquiry from the Prime Minister or the Health Secretary or the Cabinet Ministers, the inference is, let's look at avoiding things in the future. That's very important, but not at the cost of actually not forensically examining the mistakes of the past. And as for the roadmap ahead, Boris's roadmap ahead, well, I hope it works. At least it's showing caveats and cautions that suggest that the Prime Minister has learnt some of the lessons and cut back a bit on hyperbole and hubris. But I still suspect the majority of the scientific advisors still feel there is more dates than data respect in there. And if they prove right and Boris proves wrong, then I think we're looking at the subject for the next book in this series.
The first book, Paul, I've asked people to score. How would you score the British press on the pandemic out of 10?
Probably around a 6. There's been some outstanding journalism, sometimes by papers of the right, certainly, especially on things like should we say, the stench of corruption, or certainly cronyism around COVID contracts. But as far as the government's handling of it is, I would say up until the vaccine rollout, I'd give them a 4. Since the vaccine rollout, I'd be a bit generous and give them an 8.
Very good. All right. Thank you very much, Paul. Now, there's a lot of people who died in the pandemic have been non-white. Professor Barney Jaby is Professor of Professional Practice at the University of Buckingham and is a editor at large on Eastern Eye. Now, Barney, you've made a particular study of Leicester. Can you tell us why aren't the medics happy about the way the government has handled this pandemic? Over to you. Hello, Barney. Calling Barney. Are you there? If not, if Barney's not there, we can move on and come back to him. Andrew Beck, who's the China specialist. Andrew, you've got a particular point of view on the three different leaders. Can you share that with us, please?
Yeah, thank you, John. It's grotesque to regard a global pandemic as a gladiatorial contest between superpowers, and it's invidious to reduce the complexities of contemporary national governments to the tired old narrative of big men. But nevertheless, that's how the performance of the UK, the US, and China have come to be regarded. That said, how did Johnson, Trump, and Xi do? Well, Boris Johnson could have had a good pandemic. By December 2019, he was finally UK Prime Minister in his own right with a huge parliamentary majority. But he squandered the early months of his premiership and paid scant attention to the warnings coming particularly from Italy. At every stage of the pandemic's progress, his libertarianism and misplaced desire not to be the bearer of bad tidings has meant that any action has been taken too little, too late, and with too many exemptions. The proven formula for dealing effectively with COVID-19 is test, track, trace, isolate, and support, all 5 elements. What's appalling about the UK's response is that in spring 2020, nearly all of these elements were in place. For reasons known only to the UK government, this successful strategy was soon abandoned. From then on, responses were haphazard, disorganised, and frequently misunderstood or misrepresented by government ministers. To Trump, however far-fetched they became, no Homeland or House of Cards storyline could ever equal the narrative of Trump's one-term presidency. Having worked himself into a Twitter frenzy towards the end of the 2020 election, claiming that figures for US COVID-19 deaths were fake news, Trump barely acknowledged coronavirus in the dying days of his presidency. At the time, many UK columnists reflected on Trump's record, surprisingly generous. The best they could say about him was that he hadn't actually started any new wars. Well, by Inauguration Day, even that assessment was out of date. While there were only 2,500 US troops left in Afghanistan, 25,000 troops were deployed in Washington to keep the peace. The 2002 outbreak and spread of SARS affected 29 countries worldwide, with 6.6% of global fatalities recorded in China and 21.1% in Taiwan. Both vowed to learn hard lessons from this and to create comprehensive strategies for coping with any future outbreak. So on the 23 January 2020, the Chinese government passed a host of social distancing measures. They closed schools, universities, government offices, libraries, museums, and factories, cancelled or postponed large public events, limited physical contact, and isolated and supported people with COVID-19. Public transport was greatly reduced and all trans-provincial bus routes were taken out of service. In China, much of the burden of containment and control of the virus was delivered by distinctly old-fashioned human technology. Communities policed themselves to ensure everyone had their temperatures taken, outbreaks of illness were reported, and people isolating were supported appropriately with, for instance, food or medical prescription deliveries. This resulted in there being only 4,829 deaths in China as of 15th February of this year. Vitally important to China's continuing record of low or no COVID fatalities since May 2020 has been the continuation of quarantine measures with no exceptions whatsoever. Now, China's success has been frustrating for many UK commentators. A dominant narrative here is best summarized as China equals unfree but alive, rest of the world equals free but dead. Even Private Eye's usually skeptical MD now subscribes to this, quote, China managed to suppress the virus by brutally suppressing its people, but that isn't the British way. Using test, track, trace, isolate, and support measures, Taiwan has recorded COVID-19 deaths at 0.04 per 100,000. The Chinese government was similarly well prepared. The UK government was late in acknowledging the threat of COVID-19 and consistently struggled to impose seriously restrictive measures or to support its population. The US government, in the figure of Donald Trump, treated COVID as a rhetorical, geopolitical, or electoral pawn and never took its threat seriously. The results of these differing responses are clearly visible. Deaths per 100,000 head of population for China are 0.35, for the US 148.34, and for the UK 176.55. The COVID-19 balance sheet shows that Taiwan had a great pandemic, China had a very good pandemic, and the UK and the US had appalling pandemics. If governments follow the science, they will be able to contain and manage this and future viruses. If they use massive numbers of deaths as components in a game of geopolitical public relations, they will unleash chaos. As long as irrationality rules governments' responses to pandemics, they will not see the bigger picture of humanity's cruel treatments of the planet, the creatures we share it with, and those creatures' environments. While that picture remains obscure, there can be little hope for the long-term survival of a world in balance. As John Gray recently concluded, the virus has shown us that human supremacy was always a dangerous illusion. It is time to adjust to a more modest place in the life of the planet. If we're not more modest, then Gaia's revenge could be brutal and permanent. Thank you.
Have you done, Andrew? Just so you were saying really that actually China showed us the way, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Taiwan actually comes out number one if you're looking at the effectiveness of the 5-element program. As I said, test, track, trace, isolate, and support. China comes very close. And there's
you follow events in China quite closely. Where do you think the virus originated, and had the Chinese government dealt well with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing about that, John, is every time we seem to get some very good science that discovers, an outbreak of the virus in somewhere other than China, predating the Wuhan outbreak, then we get some other nonsensical story comes up, or we get some kind of diversionary tactics going on there. I mean, I really don't think that the blame game and the game of trying to identify, it's a bit like, the JFK assassination. It's the lone assassin. Actually defining when the particular outbreak occurred and where it occurred is actually not the answer to dealing with future outbreaks of the virus. As I said in conclusion, we've really got to take a serious lesson here in terms of how we actually treat the planet.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Now I'm hoping we'll be able to go to New York City now and to Angela Anti-Mossato, who's spent some of a pandemic in the UK and some of it in the USA. Angela, are you there? If you are there, would you join us and tell us how America is coping?
Yes, hi. I know. Sorry about my last name. I know it's very complicated to pronounce. It's Ante Tommaso anyway. Obviously, it's an Italian name. And yes, I'm here in New York now, and I've been for the last year actually. I arrived in the US just the day they were shutting the borders from London. I was in London obviously before, and I've been going through the whole pandemic from New York, which means that the day after I arrived, basically they shut everything, and we started this lockdown that we were talking about. And it was terrible. The first 2 months were absolutely tragic. I mean, wailing of ambulance sirens, 24/7, and lots of deaths. As you know, hospitals absolutely full. And you have seen the pictures, you heard the news. Over 22,000 deaths in New York alone in the past March and April last year. I had to say that regarding the lockdown that Toby was talking about before, I wanted to talk about my experience. Obviously, I absolutely hate the lockdown. It has been terrible for everyone. But I have to say that in New York, what I have seen is that the initial lockdown and then the mandate mask has saved life and mostly has saved our freedom. Obviously, I'm very close to London. I've been living 20 years in London. So I follow, and also to my friends, not only to the news, whatever is happening there. And I know that what's happening now in London is that there is these strict rules that obviously were not there at the very beginning, as we've all been discussing in this last hour. Here in New York, what we had was a terrible 2.5 months, absolutely nightmare. And then the mask mandate just to be able to go out. Mask mandate means that indoors, outdoors, even to go out in the streets, to go out in the park, you need to wear a mask. And this has been going on now for 11 months, no stop. New Yorkers have been wearing a mask, and this has saved, as I said, not only lives. The situation is much better now here than in the rest of the US, actually, because, you know, the numbers in America are absolutely terrible. But also this has saved lots of freedom. I mean, we had, you know, in July, we had the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and where people one on top of the other fighting with each other. Numbers went up. I mean, infections went up, but at the same time, they were very masked. And we have enjoyed, you know, a summer. We have had, you know, even the holidays in, you know, Thanksgiving and, you know, the Christmas holidays. We still had lots of freedom. Restaurants are open, even if partially open. Restaurants can have people hang around in the streets, and there are people, you know, it has been -5 degrees in the past few days here. It's been snowing. And people are still sitting in restaurants and having lunch outside. And now, obviously, they're open outside, inside as well, indoors. And theaters are reopening, cinemas are reopening, schools have been open. And I think that this mask mandate has done a real lot. Now, just to get to the bottom of this, this was the idea of Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York State. He has done really good when it comes to this, even if now, you know, as you probably know in London, he has fallen off grace because, you know, he hit some of the numbers in nursing homes, and there were really thousands of deaths in nursing homes. So this has been really handled very, very badly. But I think that New York State has been handling things, pandemic, much better than most. And I can speak from my own experience. Obviously, Trump's legacy, what is important here is to see how Trump managed to handle this. So no lockdowns, no mask mandate. He went on with electoral rallies, and we went on having meetings with these people, you know, without wearing masks and anything. And we know that this didn't really help much. And America is split. Obviously, you know, having a lockdown, having to wear masks, nobody wants that. At the same time, I think that in a way, things could improve with that. And I am comparing to the UK, to the rest of US, to my country, Italy, where obviously, you know, we know it's been the most hit country at the very beginning of this pandemic after China, obviously. So the situation is still very bad to halt, but here we have lots of freedom that I know that is not there in all of Europe, actually, and probably now not even in the rest of the United States, because with the Biden administration, things have changed a lot. Just to say one more thing, and then, you know, I leave it to you, John, if you want to ask something. The vaccine rollout is lower than in the UK here at the moment, but is going on, is going forward, and situation is definitely improving. And so we also have a plan that, you know, people will start to possibly get out more and whatever. But I can tell you that here life now is almost back to normal. Probably it's not back to normal from what we know of New York, with people, you know, just like being totally you know, on top of each other in the streets and everything, but life is actually back to normal now. So 1 year from the pandemic, the situation is definitely improving. I'm not sure how much Trump had to do with it. I can say that it was more to do with what Andrew Cuomo did, Governor Andrew Cuomo did. But yeah, this is where we are here. In the US, there are still plenty of deaths and plenty of infections. John, yes.
How shocked are people, Angela, by 500,000 deaths in the USA?
It's pretty bad. It's pretty bad because, as you said, just in the past few days, you know, the US went over, you know, past the 500,000 deaths, and this is really terrible. If you consider that, you know, there are 330 million people here, so we still have one of the very, very, very highest, you know, death rates in the world. and also obviously infection rates. We are seeing days when there were even 3, 4, 5,000 deaths, not all infections. Infections are in the probably, something like, over 100,000 a day and everything, but we are talking about deaths here. So 3,000, 4,000 deaths a day, which is more per day than the Twin Towers, disaster. So just imagine what's happening here. That is a shock, John. Yes.
More than died in the Second World War, I believe. More.
Absolutely. Yes, okay. The Second War, the both wars, and also Vietnam included. This 500,000 marks is terrible because it's really a very, very sad moment, and we are not out of it. But we hope we will.
Right. Thank you very much, Angela. Now, finally, let's go back to David Miller, who we saw at the beginning of this program with his cartoons of the pandemic, his cartoon strips. David Miller, I hope you're there. Can we perhaps now see your very latest cartoon based in February? If you'd like to show it to us, please. Over to you.
Yeah. Let me just.
Are we there?
So basically, I've done a page
Here we are.
for
Right, let's see that. Yeah.
You see, yeah. Page for January and for February.
So as I said earlier on, this book is worth buying just for Dave Miller's cartoons. Look at it. He actually chronicles the pandemic all the way through. He's got all the main people. If you want to find out what's happening, go and read Dave Miller. It's up until the 20th February. This right. Barney Chowdhury is, I believe, come out of the woodwork. Barney, are you there? If you would like, perhaps just like to give us a brief answer to the question about why are medics not been happy about the way that the government's handled the pandemic. Here we are. Over to you, Barney.
Well, John, it's quite clear, the people that I've been speaking to, that the British Medical Association in particular are quite angry about the way that the government has handled its pandemic. Straight from the beginning, medics were concerned about the planning, the organisation and its delivery. In fact, the fact is that Black and Asian people were being asked to be frontline staff without proper risk assessments taking place. There was a lack of proper personal protective equipment, and bringing it right up to date, this vaccination was described by the British Medical Association chair, Dr. Chan Nagpal, as shambolic. And this is despite the disproportionate number of deaths of Black and Asian people, 90% of whom were doctors who died as a result of the pandemic. At one stage, we found out that 35 of the 37 medics who were on the front line died. They were Black or Asian. And the British Medical Association really were not impressed with the way that the government has handled this. And they continue to be unimpressed as well, John.
So you live in Leicester. Leicester's been a city almost in permanent lockdown. What's it like?
It's been really strange. Leicester people have a habit of not flouting the law, but sort of taking it in their stride. It is a multicultural city. This afternoon, just before this webinar and book launch, I was actually in the heart of the Belgrave area. A day like today, it would have been heaving and there was not a soul around. You could almost see the tumbleweed sort of going through the busiest patch, the Golden Mile, where all the restaurants are, where all the jewelry shops are, where all the sari shops are, and all you see are now shutters. I was actually in the oldest vegetarian restaurant in the city, Bobby's, earlier on, and I wouldn't have got in on a day like today, on a Wednesday. There was no way I was going to be able to get in, but it was empty. I was able to go in. I was able to talk to the owner. I was able to interview him for another story I'm doing. And it was really a bizarre situation. So people are actually taking heed of what the government is saying. Stay away, stay at home, don't mix, socially distance. All the shops, apart from the takeaways and the restaurants, are shut. And that's the most frightening thing. When you walk around, and I go for a walk every evening, people are wearing their masks, they're wearing protective gear. So, and they are maintaining their distance. So in a city like where there are multi-generational homes, one thing that I don't understand is why the levels of the virus continue. And it could be because there are socially deprived areas of Leicester, which mean that people won't be able to stay out of their homes, stay in their homes, and they have to go out and find work.
But now Boris Johnson invites you to Downing Street and says, "No, Barney, you're British Asian. How do I persuade all the British Asians to have a vaccine?" Can you give me the answer in 30 seconds, please?
Well, first of all, make sure that you get your messaging absolutely right. Second of all, if you don't understand the fact that you cannot do it from London, that you have to set up centres elsewhere, then you're not a very good leader. And the third and final thing I would say to him is keep on making sure that you get the so-called community leaders and the religious leaders on board. If you don't do that, you ain't going to get anything done. We've seen that with all the temples and all the mosques and all the churches, which have become makeshift vaccination centres. That's the way to do it.
Okay, thank you. It's good to have you on eventually. But now we're 10 or so minutes over, so if we could finish off finally with the book plug. The book is called, published by Bite Size. It's available in Amazon and other places. Please buy it. You've seen some of the authors and some of the non-authors. This video you can see forever and a day on YouTube. But that's it. Thank you very much. If you stayed with us for an hour and 10 minutes, well done. And that's it. Good night.
Yeah.